Testing, testing, okay? Well, we have a very small crowd here, but I know there are hundreds watching at home, so welcome to all of you. We are so privileged to have Andrea Mihal here with us today. We had her scheduled for last spring, and then because of COVID, we had to cut our season short. So we scheduled her again, and now we almost had to cut it short again, but she is here. She's an administrator with Holland Public Schools and in charge of their early college program, which she may talk a little bit more about. And we're very interested in that because we have a grandson in that program as well. She's been with Holland Public Schools for 7 years, and she's originally from Michigan, Detroit area, but she got to live in Phoenix for 7 years while she was doing her graduate work at Northern Arizona University. She lives here in Holland with her husband and 2 children, ages 7 and 10. I asked her about hobbies, and she's like, I guess time with friends and family, cooking, watching her kids' sports, and all those kinds of things. So we are very privileged to have her with us. We used to have Brian Davis come almost every year, and he said one time, you should call Andrea and have her come. So she's here. So let's open with a word of prayer, and then I'll turn it over to her. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you on this rather bleak November day. Thank you for being our hope, especially in these COVID times. We just pray for relief from that plague soon, and we pray for unity in our country as we face these problems together. Be with Andrea as she speaks to us, and with all the teachers and administrators in all of our schools as they face these very difficult days. We ask these things in your name. Amen.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining here live. And those of you that are tuning in virtually, thank you so much for being here and taking some time. I don't have anything to add in terms of introduction. Thank you for the very kind introduction. Like Sherry mentioned, my name is Andrea Mihal. This is my 7th year with Holland Public. Before that, I was a high school teacher, teaching biology and anatomy and physiology in Phoenix, Arizona. But I'm originally from the Detroit area, so moving to Holland kind of brought me back to Michigan. And I was just super fortunate to land in Holland Public Schools. So I know that this presentation's been kind of a long time coming. Like Sherry mentioned, we were going to do this before everything changed, right, back in the spring. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity. And I'll share with you a little bit about what's happening in schools right now. Holland Public, we were fortunate to be able to offer a full face-to-face option for our students this year, K-12, as well as a full online option for our students to choose from. About 77% of our students chose face-to-face instruction 5 days a week, and about 23% chose a full online instructional program, just as related to how we make things work, doing school in a global pandemic. So we've been exploring and doing and trying things that none of us ever thought we would have to try during a time none of us in this room ever thought we would be in, right? Our teachers have been incredibly resilient and resourceful and innovative to meet these challenges. Our students and families have been incredibly supportive and totally resilient. In the buildings, like mask wearing is required. We've got one-way hallways, cohorting, keeping students in groups together, lunch in classrooms, even at the high school level. And the students have just been absolute champions. And you know, they don't miss a beat. They were just super glad to be back in school. In terms of our high school, however, you may see or kind of hear it through the grapevine. Our high school, Holland High, is going remote next week. And that has to do with just positive cases and people that are in quarantine as related to that. And just like, I think 10% of our staff will be out of the building, which is really difficult to cover with substitute teachers and things like that. But what we've noticed with all of our safety protocols that we have in place, even an individual that might have a positive COVID-19 case, their close contacts remain COVID-free, right? And so the masks are working, the sanitizing is working, the one-way hallways are working. We're really proud of our efforts. And again, teachers have just been phenomenal as we try to navigate these waters, doing something that has never been done. So a lot of positivity still to be celebrated. So this presentation, Engaging Community to Advance Racial Justice in Schools, I have to tell you, this sort of came to me back in the spring. I'm involved in in many different community organizations. And I was participating with one community organization back in the spring, maybe it was winter, who knows, it's all a blur. And they were talking about donating socks to all the students in one of the buildings in our district. And I thought, like, that's awesome and super important in terms of basic needs being met for our students. We know that they come with various challenges. But what else? What's kind of beneath that surface? And then certainly as the winter rolls around, a couple years ago, there's a coat drive, and every student at Holland Heights got a brand new winter coat. Super important, critical that basic needs are being met. But it made me kind of think like, there's lots of opportunities to donate and to give and be charitable for our schools, and we're fortunate to have community partners that come alongside us every step of the way when those needs arise. But I can't help but thinking, like, we do this every year, and years go by, and yet students and families still struggle with food scarcity and access to affordable housing and all of these issues. And so it really just kind of made me think, like, how have we as a district and as a community maybe not leveraged the expertise or the resources of our community partners to really start digging at root causes? Because we continue to see there will always be another opportunity to give, and that's super important. I was talking the other day in a group about teachers, and teachers, as resilient as they've been, it's super stressful what they're having to do and navigate. And a group I'm a part of, they said, well, just to help deal with teacher stress, how about we give gift cards, or we could deliver pizzas. Everybody loves food, right? And then I thought, like, that's awesome, but that's so temporary, and that feeling is fleeting, and we feel good, and people are grateful for that. But what really might help teachers with stress during these times, thinking about teacher evaluation and resource availability as they try to navigate these worlds. So anyways, that's kind of where all of this kind of came to be. So I don't know that I have every answer today. Today's not about answers. It's really just about starting a conversation maybe about different approaches, how we might be able to partner as community and engage and involve communities to advance justice in schools. I'll make the connection to the racial justice piece as well. So as you probably know, Holland Public, it's a majority non-white and majority economically disadvantaged district, and we are nestled in the heart of a majority white affluent tourist destination. So that's kind of an interesting space to be in, first and foremost. We are incredibly fortunate, however, we are very lucky to have numerous community partners who donate time and resources to support various needs when they might arise. But what I've come to learn as I've been in the district for 7 years is that this is cyclical, right? Like, these things happen over and over again. So despite the countless relationships that have been developed over the years, achievement and discipline data still shows disproportionate levels of success in our schools. And really simply put, that second bullet is really as blunt as it can be. Students of color and students of low socioeconomic status do not perform as well as their wealthier or white peers in Holland Public Schools. And being that that's the majority of our population, that raises some big concerns and questions. So as a district, we've been engaged in the last, it's probably getting close to 10 years, on some real deep dive, looking in the mirror type, equity work, trying to really get at how do we improve outcomes, close achievement gaps, things like that. But really what I wanted to do this morning for a little bit of time, and this is barely enough time to kind of dip the toe in and begin to scratch the surface, but hopefully this might be the beginning of a conversation that we could continue to have down the road. So really today's about looking at ways we've engaged with and leveraged some of the expertise that the community brings to improve student outcomes. So this is just some of my thinking that has just kind of emerged as related to some experiences and connections that I've had in my roles over the years. So really the goal of our time today is just to consider the difference between charity and justice as we attempt to move beyond basic needs to explore new opportunities to advance equity in and beyond schools. So that's kind of the goal. This graphic certainly shows kind of represents why that might matter. I put schools in the center because I live and work in schools, right? But I think in a lot of ways, schools represent like the hub within the community. And definitely all of those other elements that exist in a community eventually show up in schools, right? And so some of the struggles that our students have are related to housing, are related to healthcare, are related to various employment opportunities for families, things like that. So the more we can kind of think about that holistic approach, some opportunities we might have to improve outcomes. In terms of norms, so in schools we're used to like setting a social contract or making norms or group agreements when we dig into topics that might be new or difficult or even potentially controversial. And so we're just going to rely on the philosophy of my friend Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein said, "I have no special talents. I am just passionately curious." And so that's what I would like us to kind of frame our time together this morning and to really maybe kind of sustain that curiosity just into the days and weeks to come. You've probably heard of Albert Einstein, but you might not have heard of my good friend Calvin Terrell, who said, "Don't be judgmental, be curious." And so that's what I ask of everybody today, kind of how we show up to this space. When we're judgmental, that blocks learning, but stay in a place of curiosity. I want to understand. And how much more united we'd be, right, if that was the place. So we're going to talk just a little bit about charity and justice. This is the season of giving. So it's timely that this presentation didn't happen in the spring and now is happening now with Thanksgiving coming next week. I think it's next week, a week from Thursday. It's such a blur. And then, of course, the Christmas holiday season coming forward. And so, one, it's interesting that we, as a society, refer to it as like the season of giving, as it's like a certain time period, and not just like a state of mind and being we should be in all year long. But as we think about some of these ways that we give, that we engage, whether it's coat drives and food drives and donating, things like that, it's important as we do those to always be looking at kind of beneath the surface. What is the cause that has made that necessary? So that's what the challenge is today. So I'm going to start with a parable, the parable of the river. There are a couple different versions of this. You may have heard it, and I'm going to go with kind of a shortened version just because of time. One day, a group of villagers was working in the fields by a river. Suddenly, someone noticed a baby floating downstream. A woman rushed out and rescued the baby, brought it to shore, and cared for it. During the next several days, more babies were found floating downstream, and villagers rescued them as well. But before long, there was a steady stream of babies floating downstream. Soon the whole village was involved in the many tasks of the rescue work. While not all the babies could be saved, the villagers felt they were doing well to save as many as they did. When passerbyers would come, they would call them over and ask for help. Before long, the village became exhausted with all this rescue work. Some villagers suggested they go upstream to discover how all these babies were getting into the river in the first place. Had a mysterious illness stricken these poor children? Had the shoreline been made unsafe by an earthquake? Was some hateful person throwing them in deliberately? Was an even more exhausted village upstream abandoning them out of hopelessness? A huge controversy erupted in the village. One group argued that every possible hand was needed to save the babies since they were barely keeping up with the current flow. The other group argued that if they found out how the babies were getting into the water further upstream, they could repair the situation up there that would save all the babies and eliminate the need for those costly rescue operations downstream. "Don't you see," cried someone, "if we find out how they're getting into the river, we can stop the problem and no babies will drown. By going upstream, we can eliminate the cause of the problem." So when you hear that story, and maybe some of you have heard this story, I just want us to think collectively. How do you think a story like that might apply to our society or to our world today? how does this parable or story relate to a couple sayings that I feel like are pretty commonplace? Like, give a man a fish and you'll feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him the rest of his life. Or phrases like, you can't put a Band-Aid on a broken leg. So the first time I heard that story, it was really enlightening to me. Sherry mentioned I grew up on the east side of the state. I attended Catholic school for 12 years, and a huge part of my upbringing was grounded in charity and service learning, right? I was often at the soup kitchen or organizing canned food drives, things like that. That type of service and charity was a huge part and very formational in terms of how I see myself and my place in the world. Incredibly good experiences. I would also advocate, like in schools, we should be doing service learning as like core components of our instruction. So let's kind of first think about charity as a concept, and we're going to contrast that with justice as we think about different ways to perhaps engage community to support schools. So works of charity. And these are things that I myself have been involved in. I'm certain that folks in this room and people watching at home have been involved in as well. So these are often represented by like social services. This might be a private or an individual act. Acts of charity, works of charity respond to immediate basic needs. I gave a couple examples in HPS, like I'm donating socks to everybody at one school, coats to everybody somewhere else. This provides a direct service, something like food or shelter or clothing. Works of charity require repeated actions. Like I mentioned, I noticed that, we're the season of giving again, those cycles of, 7 years in the district, and it's another year of similar types of activities. It's directed at the effects of injustice or inequities and really addresses the symptoms of those pieces. And quite honestly, these are acts that can be satisfying and gratifying. Often they're, well, I would say probably all the time, they're not controversial in any way. And there is a sense of immediate gratification for the giver. When I donate my time or resources or show up, it makes me feel good. And that's super important. So some of the examples, and again, these are a few that I've mentioned and things that I've been involved in myself, but volunteering at a homeless shelter, volunteering at a soup kitchen, we did that every year when I was in high school. Donating to food banks, clothing drives, fundraisers, sponsoring families, tutoring, building houses, donating, participating in community beautification programs, cleaning up. And we're fortunate in Holland Public, and we're fortunate in this community that we have individuals that show up and step up whenever we ask, even when we don't ask, right, to be able to make some of these things happen. But I want to think, when we engage in these types of things as community members, again, shifting the conversation to begin to look beneath the surface. In other words, if I'm volunteering my time to tutor or read to children, what impact is that having on student achievement and student outcomes? And is that, eventually we'd want to put ourselves out of a job, right? So that students are coming prepared and reading at grade level and accessing the curriculum in ways that their peers are as well. So kind of digging beneath that. A great example of kind of a person who's been a pillar, all of these words seem like so beneath, like how amazing she is. But Mother Teresa, I think we're all familiar with as somebody who is very much an exemplar. Again, that seems like such an exemplar is an understatement, but I can't find a better word right now. She founded the Missionaries of Charity, dedicated her life to that service. And, she worked on soup kitchens and clinics and family counseling programs and orphanages, and her Missionaries of Charity, they take vows to help the poorest of the poor. And so she's a phenomenal example, again, that being totally an understatement, of charity and kind of charitable works. The other concept we want to start thinking about then, if we're gonna maybe work to address or look at root cause, is the concept of justice. And so when you think works of justice, you think, maybe some more public acts or collective actions. responding to a longer-term need, things that promote social change in institutions, acts that might work to resolve structural injustice, acts that are directed at the root cause of things like social injustice or people's suffering. And these are sometimes things that are exciting or kind of get the adrenaline rushed, and they can be controversial as well. And I think it's important to always consider in these instances, you don't always see the results, right? You don't always see the fruits of your labor. And so anybody who's been involved in any type of justice work, whether personally or professionally, knows you sort of have to embrace thinking like, I might do all of these things, but never really see the impact of my efforts. So it looks a little bit different. So in terms of examples, these might take the form of legislative advocacy, various community organizing or changing policies, that type of work, working to improve the education system, supporting environmental protection laws, participating in a living wage campaign, things like that. This might look more like political action, responsible purchasing and investing, calling and writing elected officials, boycotts even. And we might even list things like, acts of civil disobedience or protests or things like that. This might have to do with showing up at a city council meeting and making a public comment, or attending a Holland Public Board meeting, right? So kind of getting involved a little bit differently in that way. So if we want to kind of connect to an example of what an individual engaged in justice work, Rosa Parks might be an example that comes to mind. As I'm sure everybody knows, she was an American activist in the civil rights movement, best known for her role with the Montgomery bus boycott. And so, again, that was a pretty significant, to say the least, act that was critical within the civil rights movement. So if we take it back to the river for just a couple of seconds, which action, and maybe this can be a little share out, I don't know, can we have audience participation? Is that, I don't know, just a little share out. I'm like, I feel very like lecture-y versus teacher-y, but we're all distanced, and anyways. So kind of going back to the river parable, what action in the parable represented like a charitable work? Volunteer, raise your hand, shout it out behind the mask. Bingo, grabbing the babies out of the river. So scooping them up, taking them to shore, getting them care, one after the other. What action represented a justice-oriented approach? Going upstream. Yeah, going upstream. How are these babies getting into the river? And that's what I think that I'd love to see us doing as community. So really not shifting, but I don't know, seeing out of both, simultaneously looking at charity and justice as really important pieces. And so, frankly, with this tale, with this parable, both approaches were necessary. I think we could probably all agree on that. So both approaches were necessary. The charity approach, rescuing the babies, met that immediate need. Nobody would be okay with watching that unfold. And the justice approach, stopping them from being put in the first place, was also an incredibly important need, going to the root cause. What was the root cause of the problem? And neither approach would be enough on its own. So these things often work in tandem, they work in concert with one another. So, in terms of just like, let's be really real and really honest, we have to keep in mind that justice solutions are rarely simple. I think when we looked at the list, these are long and laborious and things that take time. They're rarely simple. Even as I was building this presentation, I thought like, well, maybe I could just rattle off a checklist of like how community could help schools advance racial justice. And like, there is no checklist, I think is the point there. These things are complex and take lots of folks collaborating and working together. And I love the second bullet that just says like, nobody ever said changing the world was easy. So that is just something to think about. So I'm gonna attempt to play a quick little video clip. If it works, I don't know, we'll see. and then we'll go through a couple other little pieces. So this is just kind of like said a different way. Let's see if it works on my little phone screen share. Oh, can I get a little volume in the back? Well, is it me? It can't be. All right. Maybe we won't.
If you do get the volume, you're gonna need this.
Okay, we can skip it.
Won't come up.
And I'm on.
Usually there's
Okay, no worries. No worries. Any good teacher would have a backup plan, right? So we're just going to skip it. The backup plan is skip it. So here's a good backup plan. We'll just share words from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I think this does a great job of summarizing the content in the video. So here's my backup plan, just in quote form, but really sort of the approach that I'm wanting us to begin to consider as community members. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. says, philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of the economic injustice which make philanthropy necessary. So I'll read it one more time because it's super important. Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice which make philanthropy necessary. So, you could swap out that word philanthropy with others, right, around just charity, things like that. And we're super lucky in this community. We're really fortunate that there's just endless nonprofit organizations and folks doing really important work. But again, we must not overlook the circumstances that created a need for that organization or nonprofit or charitable act to exist in the first place. And so just said another way, I mentioned my Catholic school upbringing, so we've got to weave that in somewhere. Charity will never be true charity unless it takes justice into account. Let no one attempt with small gifts of charity to exempt themselves from the great duties imposed by justice. And that was from Pope Pius XI. So again, really wanting to think about, there's babies, but there's something happening that's getting them into this position where they are. So how are we addressing both? So we're gonna do a little homework at school. So I'm gonna read a little scenario, kind of like the parable. And so I want us just to kind of like take a little bit of time to practice. How might we define a root cause of a situation, of an issue, of a hardship that we identify? And then what might a charitable solution approach be? And then what might a justice approach be? So I'm going to read a little scenario. I'm going to take us back to the 1950s. And we can have conversation about whether or not this story that I read could be a story that we tell in 2020. So here's the quick scenario. Let's say it's 1950 and there's a problem in Virginia or any other southern state. The problem is that a public school that only black children attend needs new history books. The books they have were published before World War II and are hopelessly out of date. But there's no money to buy new books because the schools that serve black students are seriously underfunded. How can you deal with the problem? One way would be to respond with charity. Both black and white individuals could contribute or raise funds that allow this school to buy newer books. In fact, sometimes that's exactly what has happened in situations like this one. But what would be the best response? It is, of course, good for students to get new or newer books. But giving the school new books only addresses the immediate problem. It doesn't look at the cause of that problem. What was the underlying cause of that problem in 1950? The public schools that were provided for children of color did not get enough money to buy new books. while the schools for white students had new books. When we look beyond the immediate book shortage, we can see the cause of the problem isn't lack of money. That's just a symptom. The problem is a system that favored one race over another, also known as racism. In 1950, the separate but equal doctrine said that it was acceptable for black children to go to schools separate from white children, as long as those schools were as good as the white kids' schools. In reality, though, those schools were rarely as good as the white students' schools. Identifying racism as a root cause of that problem as well makes it possible to see another solution. That solution is to seek justice, to take action that would contribute to making a more equitable education system. In other words, look beyond the textbook problem and look at how to change the underlying conditions that caused the textbook problem in the first place. Of course, in the 1950s, court cases challenged the legality of separate but equal schools. In Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools were illegal and opened the door for black children to have access to the same education as white students. So that comes from Teaching Tolerance, which is a website that has a whole host of resources for students and young people and teachers and individuals to kind of unpack issues like that. And so I guess my first question to this group is kind of hearing that scenario read, and I kind of answered some of the questions in the story, and just maybe by like a thumbs up or thumbs down. Hearing that, does that sound like something like if I change the date to 2020, that might be something that sounds like how things still exist? So thumbs up if you think that could be a story like that we transplant into 2020 and sounds kind of similar. So thumbs up if you agree, thumbs down if you disagree. All right, I'm seeing a bunch of thumbs up. Okay, maybe half and half. And I know this scenario kind of played out with some specific things about laws around school segregation, and those things might not exist, but in terms of, kind of thinking about it holistically, is that something that could exist now, perhaps? So ultimately, when we think about a situation like this, and this is a specific school example, we always want to unpack what is the cause, what's that root cause, and then what might a charitable solution be or a justice-oriented solution. So a charitable solution in this scenario is donating books, right? Could be fundraisers, could be donating money, could be just making sure these books are up to date and ready to go. And then, of course, a justice solution might be more addressed at like school funding, access to resources. And of course, this talked about segregation in general, like who gets a good school, what does it mean, things like that. So digging in a little bit more deeply. So when we think about a whole number of issues, and unfortunately, there's no shortage of issues or problems that we face. And many of us, we face these issues around all sorts of racial and ethnic lines and lines of class and gender and things like that. So economic stability, neighborhoods, education, food, community, healthcare, things like that. And underneath this list, you'll see some of the issues that present themselves. So the goal is, as we think about symptoms, as we think about an issue that we're addressing, that we want to donate, exercise what would normally be a charitable act, really beginning to dig deeper to the root cause of the problem. So again, these solutions are rarely simple, we'll remind you here, and no one said changing the world was easy. So I know it's too tiny to probably read, and even for folks at home, but we could identify a number of issues that exist and persist in our communities. And it wouldn't take long for me to convince you how those issues show up in schools and how they affect and impact a student's ability to be successful in school, and they show up in our student achievement numbers and all of those things. But hunger, homelessness, unemployment, an elderly person living alone on limited resources, somebody without health insurance gets ill and needs to be hospitalized. So really, I would want to challenge us to really present or face any of these issues with a framework of, what's that root cause, what might be a charitable solution, and what might be a justice solution. So as we think about our own involvement and my own involvement in various community initiatives and organizing efforts and different things, these are some questions to consider, both as participants or leaders of these works. So maybe before approaching an issue, are you aware of any existing leadership in the community you plan to serve? So it begs the question, as folks were doing everything they could to, donate winter coats to one of our elementary schools, do those folks doing the organizing really know the kids or the community that they're donating to, right? Or the various stories that exist, or are there other leadership efforts within those communities? Do we see and understand the historical factors that underlie the issues that we aim to tackle? That's kind of the big theme of this morning. And the second question on number 2 is really key. And this is where I want community members holding us in schools accountable. Are we analyzing the inputs and the outputs of our efforts? In other words, if we have tutoring programs and reading programs where volunteers are coming in and giving of their own time and resources, in what ways are community organizations holding schools accountable to reading outcome data, right? Is it making a difference? Ultimately, we should be putting charity out of a job as we address justice and injustices that persist. How do we engage with and support organizations? Do the organizations we support and engage with hold a deficit-based narrative about the community they're serving, or is it an asset-based narrative? How can we help folks pivot and make the change rooted in justice? So does the act of charity, does the act perpetuate and support the problem, or does it help to dig at the root a little bit? Because as we know, unless you dig at the root, those weeds are just going to grow back, at least in my garden, that's for sure. Getting close to the community that we serve, that's really important, to listen, to learn, to partner. Is that core to the change initiative or the community organization that you're working with? Does everybody have an intimate understanding and knowledge of the communities that they're tasked with serving? So again, as we think about giving gift cards to teachers, that's excellent, and that will immediately give a little reprieve, right? It's a little respite care, perhaps. But do we understand some of the nuances of the situations, the challenges that are being dealt with? And charity is absolutely commendable, like with the river story, and it's necessary. But justice is transformational. And so when we think about ourselves expending resources, financial resources, time resources, how do we want to spend those? So kind of the big picture is, how does this advance racial justice? And so as I constructed this presentation, it feels all over the place for me. But it's this idea to say that we need folks partnering with schools, holding us accountable, and helping us dig at the roots that create the symptoms that we see in terms of inequities and hardships and things that manifest themselves. And so just in terms of a little bit of school data, this is just national stuff. It's not Holland Public specific. But we know that, schools are kind of like the epicenter. When our schools are healthy, that means our communities are healthy and so forth. We also know that, that education is really like a way out for a lot of students and a lot of families. It's transformational. I lead our early college program in Holland Public, and if you're not familiar with early college, it's a pathway for students to earn a full associate's degree, all paid for by the district. And I can think about one story in particular. I had a couple of students that had dealt with homelessness. They had experienced homelessness for a number of years. And when we tested all the kids to see if they could get that basic skills test to get into the college program, one student, when she found her results that she passed and she got in, she broke down in tears. She broke down in tears not because it was such an awesome test, or she was super bright and it would have, but it was about what that meant for her and her family, what that meant about transforming and breaking cycles of generational poverty and homelessness for her family. And so we know that education is a major place where it can change and transform outcomes for students and their families. And we also know that some of the issues that we mentioned related to housing and employment and living wage and healthcare and education and access, affordable housing in our community is a big thing that we need to dig into and tackle, and that absolutely shows up in schools. When you think about schools and like transiency, when students change schools, it's like, I think the data says they lose like 3 or 4 months, even if they go right from here to West Ottawa. And so for students that can't find affordable housing or families that can't find affordable housing and they have to move in relation to where the housing is, that has major academic impacts. And we also know that, so all of those issues that we listed a couple of slides ago disproportionately affect communities of color and low-income communities. And so when we address these issues collectively, it improves outcomes for everybody. So these are just a couple of slides. I probably don't need to show this necessarily, but certainly home ownership rates, food insecurity, access to healthcare, things like that, disproportionately affect low-income communities and communities of color. And so certainly addressing these issues, attacking root causes, seeks to advance justice for all. This is a slide that is probably too tiny to see, but COVID-19 has certainly shed light on, the inequities that exist and persist. Just thinking about the ways that, some of the hardships related to the pandemic have affected certain communities has really kind of highlighted and illustrated that very scenario. So to transform outcomes, so this is our ask. Does every presentation have an ask? I don't know. To transform outcomes, schools really need community to partner with us to address root causes of the issues that are most impacting our students. And I would add to this and say, hold us accountable to those outcomes as well. And it's really about taking a new approach, that generosity should never be a substitute for justice, that issues that we experience, that we see manifest themselves in our students' lives and the lives of even us in this room, would cease to exist if we can begin to dig a little bit more at the root cause. So just like the parable of the river, I would challenge us as community members to do what we can, certainly to save the babies, right? But to simultaneously be always looking upstream at what is the cause, what is creating this situation to occur. And if we can if we can deal with that, we already know, that countless babies would be saved, right, related to that scenario. And when I say babies, it's interesting that this parable, maybe it seems a little goofy, but when I think about schools, that's exactly what it is, right? It's our students, it's their lives, it's their families, and the stronger and kind of healthier communities we can build, the better outcomes we will see. So I think I talked super fast. I'm not sure. I know we wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions, so hopefully I did that. But I'm just kind of a little bit of a fast talker, so if there's any questions, I'd be open for that. And again, my goal would be how do was that me? Oh, don't touch the red button.
Probably blew out the speaker. Testing, testing, testing. Okay, I think the people at home maybe can't hear the questions, and so if you have a question, if you could, ask it quickly, and then if you could repeat the question.
Yeah.
So does anybody have a question right now? Can you just talk loud and then repeat it?
Great question. So the question was, for those listening at home, that everybody wants instant results. We all want that kind of immediate impact. And what we're suggesting this morning are things that take a ton of time. And how do we do and address that? I hope I paraphrase that okay. That's a great question. I think, is it a mindset shift? Is it just saying exactly what you just said? And just kind of coming to terms with that. For myself, I've been involved in equity work and some racial justice work since I started teaching in 2006. And at first I was like, all right, racism's a thing. Like, let's just all have a workshop and an assembly and like we can fix it by Tuesday. And then as I let things marinate, I'm like, whoa, like we're talking about 400 years of things that are ingrained into systems and policies and and in many cases were intentional. Oh my gosh, we're not gonna fix it overnight. And then of course my next thought was like, well then how can I even help? Where should I even get involved? Like, what's the point, right? But it was really just kind of coming to terms with like, look, my goal and my passion is to just like leave the world a little better than I found it. So maybe embracing that mindset helps. That if we can impact, I don't know, even like start to chip away at, and it's being okay. It's really just frankly being okay with not seeing the fruits of your labor in your lifetime, and just being okay with that. But knowing it's the right work to do. So it's patience. It's like it's a revolutionary act of patience and stamina. And a phrase I use often is like, do we have stamina to stay in the fight, to end homelessness, to end hunger, to end poverty, to end, insert, yeah. Yes. Great. So the question was, from my point of view, if I had to like make percentages based upon like Holland Public or just kind of schools locally, what's the percentage of like charitable works versus like folks kind of digging at it, root causes more into the justice side of things. I'm going to say this with like a ton of gratitude and humility and appreciation for folks that like do exactly those charitable acts and works. Like, there are numbers of basic needs and things that we couldn't do without those partnerships. So when I share my percentages, in no way is that like a judgment or a critique. But it's, I don't know, like 80-20, maybe, I don't know. I think and maybe this is just this is just strictly my opinion. So that's not a quote representative of Holland Public Schools. So don't call Brian Davis and say like, here, no. So just for my opinion, and that just might be my own lens, but it's super, super heavy, charity donations, things like that. But we need folks partnering with us to say like, so if we're looking at outcome, disparities in terms of achievement with students of color and white students in Holland Public, we need people saying like, show me your curriculum, or let's look at materials and resources, or let's look at teacher training and professional development. Let's look at policies and structures and kind of digging into that. We need folks who are doing tutoring and reading to kids, challenging the district and saying like, why can't these kids read at grade level? And like, how do we kind of attack and address that in different ways, right? So yeah, I think it's super, yeah. But also like, that's it's comfortable, it's easy, it's fast, it makes us feel good. It's something we feel like we have control over, we can impact. Everything else seems so big and kind of outside of our control.
Troubled by the apparent opposition that people have to the Black Lives Matter. There are those who say, no, anybody who thinks that there's a special need for racial justice for people of color are all wrong. They're all wrong. And so I'm wondering what the spirit, if you can share, what is the spirit in the Holland Public School system for this notion of, oh, this is all an effort to confuse people. Everything is going well, and all lives matter. We don't need to do anything special. What's going on in the public school system about this debate?
Do we have another hour or three? I thank you for your question. For those listening at home, gosh, I probably won't paraphrase it well, but it was really just a question that there has been opposition related to the Black Lives Matter movement and individuals saying, like, there's no need to hyper-focus on one particular group in the way that they experience marginalization or oppression, and folks that come back and say all lives matter. How do we kind of reconcile that inside the schools? I would love that to be like part 2 of this. And as I worked to create this, I'm like bringing in some of those pieces, and then I thought, we don't have enough time. But in schools, we recognize that inequities exist and disparities exist, and they persist. And what I really appreciate about working for Holland Public is, like, we will own it and share it and hold up a mirror to our own selves and our own outcomes and say, like, in an effort to say, how can we learn and collaborate and do better and grow and change? In 2013, 2014, Holland Public did a whole equity audit. And so we brought in folks from Michigan State University to really look at focus groups and achievement data to see, like, who's succeeding and who's not, and to begin to help us figure out why that is. And yeah, when you think about the stark reality that students of color and students of low socioeconomic status and HPS don't do as well as their wealthier or white peers, you can really take one of 2 stances there. You can either say, like, those groups of students or people just, like, are somehow, like, not as intelligent, or have some sort of, like, deficit or defect that, like, makes them unable to, like, figure out our way of doing things. Or we can say, like, maybe the systems and structures and policies and things that we have set up, like, advantage some and disadvantage others, either intentionally or unintentionally. And so that's what we're digging into in Holland Public. How our practices, our policies, our perceptions, privileging some and marginalizing others, again, either intentionally or unintentionally. By nature, public schools, and certainly Holland Public Schools, were set up for certain students, and those are not the majority of the students that fill our hallways. And so we've been really honest about that. Our district put out a statement this summer when lots of protests were going on after the murder of George Floyd, and was very honest and open, saying, like, Black Lives Matter. And the analogy that I've heard used in the past is about, like, a fire. Like, think about a neighborhood, and there's a whole bunch of houses in the neighborhood, and one house in the neighborhood has caught fire. Fire department shows up. All lives would say, like, well, hey, all houses matter. And they absolutely do. Like, this house and this house, they absolutely do. But the fire truck is going to respond to the one that's on fire, and that's the one they're going to spray with water first. And so that's really the intent of that movement, to say, like, we've got a group in a community, that's suffering, and we ought to kind of acknowledge and address that. It does not mean Black Lives Matter more. What it means is Black Lives Matter too, because when we look back at our history, one of the stories within the scenario I shared earlier about school segregation, our history would tell us that they haven't always mattered, right? So that's a whole longer conversation, and I hope I'm even doing a little bit of justice in terms of just, like, describing that for a rainy Sunday morning. But yeah, those are, and my hope would be that can be follow-up conversations to even this conversation as we dig deeper into, like, the root causes of maybe some of the racial injustices. But yeah, HPS is saying, like, hey, this is our reality. We've got data that supports these realities, and what do we need to do so that we can see justice for all kids? the data also suggests that when we focus on, racial justice efforts, it also positively impacts all students. Yeah.
You indicated that, of course, this is a long, long process, a long problem. What resources are available to you that are helping to finally get back on a track that works?
Yeah, the question was, this is a long process, so what are some resources that are available to us that are starting to get things back on track? I think our people are our biggest resource. When you can bring together folks of multiple perspectives to begin to dig into these things in a way that's collaborative, I think that's what's best. And so there's various, organizations and committees within Holland Public looking at different things, and really wanting to gather and collect multiple perspectives to gain some understanding. So I think it's our people. Our people are our greatest strength. Our youth, our students. Sometimes we as adults, we can intentionally or unintentionally dismiss what our young people are telling us, either by way of their data that we look at, or by way of what they actually tell us. So we're super fortunate in Holland Public that we have really dedicated and committed students who want to see change, who want to create better outcomes for all kids. We've had a student group last year who designed and facilitated professional development for our staff about, helping teachers build skills to facilitate, collaborative conversations about race and other topics that could be potentially polarizing. And so it was our students that said, hey, we want to do this, we want to teach, we want to build. And so really just finding opportunities to amplify student voice is really one of our greatest assets. Because just like the textbook example shared, money is a thing, but it's less about. So I think we have the money and the resources. It's about amplifying and our people and student voices and the voices of our families and finding really creative ways to do that. I don't know, that probably doesn't answer the question, but it's still a work in progress. I think that all I can say is it's still absolutely a work in progress. Kind of 10 years, close to 10 years, well, 2013-ish, but earlier part of 2010 when we were starting to ask some of those questions in Holland Public, we're really, even 10 years in, we're really just getting started.
Real quickly, Kids Hope probably fits under justice, and I'm wondering if there is a counterpart at the higher levels for that program.
The question was about Kids Hope. I don't believe there's a Kids Hope counterpart at the high school level. But, when we think about, even a whole next level conversation would be around, I mentioned at the beginning that 23% of our student population, they're engaged in a full online schedule, which is really difficult and hard to do. So as we start looking at the data for students who are at home, working from home, completely, in some ways, independent in terms of their coursework without direct teacher support, and some with parents that work or can't, provide all that academic support. We're already starting to see some disparities between students who chose online versus face-to-face in terms of progress and grades and things like that. And then we can also see some connections between which of our students and families chose online versus face-to-face. When we think about some of the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19, it wouldn't surprise us when we look at some of the students demographically who might have selected to go to school online, and what does that mean long-term for achievement or widening of achievement disparities. And so again, getting creative with folks about how do we address some of those things coming down the pipeline? Again, it's difficult to even think is that a Band-Aid or is that kind of justice work root cause stuff? But like we kind of mentioned, both are necessary. So yeah, that probably doesn't answer. I totally took that on a sidebar, but
No, our time is up, but I hope you join me in thanking Andrea for coming and urging her to start on part 2 so we can have her back when she gets that one part done. And if you have any more questions, you could ask her if everybody wears a mask. And we hope to see you next week, and we hope for better weather. It sounds really awful out there. So
yes.
thank you.
Yeah,
for
thank you
coming.
very much, everybody. Please travel safely, stay healthy, stay well. And I'm happy to mask up and hang out and answer any questions that you all might have. So thank you so much for being here.